Hey guys, today I'm back in Besiege, and I wanted to try making a weird engine. I was looking around for a bit until I found this design, called the Napier Deltic. It has 3 sets of opposing pistons in this triangle shape, and it just looks so weird yet satisfying that I had to try making it. So, let's get right into it. So I'm just starting out in the sandbox, and the first thing I'm doing is just building up a big wooden rod like this, and the reason is I just want to start building up the legs of my triangle, just so I can get a feel for exactly how to do that. Now, making triangles in Besiege is a little weird, because you need the vertices to line up pretty much perfectly in order for this engine to work. So I gotta be a little careful with exactly how I rotate it, and just make sure that everything's rotating properly and that all of the legs are the same exact length. So I put in 2 identical legs with the corner missing like this, and then finally once I played the rotate tool enough, I got it right where I wanted it, and then finally I just made the other leg in a very similar way. And after I got that, I made sure to pin all the legs in place so that they wouldn't just fall to the ground. And then I used some steel plates. Now the reason I'm using these is to make the walls of the pistons, because it's just easy to put them on, and I'm hoping that it's going to keep the pistons from just falling out of the cylinders. So put on 3 pistons like this. I'm not going to use these as my power source, I just wanted to use them temporarily to see how well everything was sliding. And you can actually see here, they're jamming up quite a lot on the sides, so I was a little worried that this wasn't quite going to work, but I just put in a water cannon, which is going to be my main source of power. I'll come back to that in a bit though, and I started working on the crankshaft. Now for this I just have a swivel joint with a log on it, and then finally a swivel joint on top of that log, and the swivel joint on top of the log is going to be attached to the piston. So speaking of which, putting in that piston now, just a single wooden block like that, and then a swivel joint on top of it, and then I realized I just had to rotate the crankshaft 90 degrees to get this all to work properly. But once I got that, I just made sure to brace the piston to the crankshaft. Now here it was sort of working, but I had realized my problem was I actually made the log attached to the crankshaft just a little too long, so I made it 2 blocks long instead of 3. And here you can see it's performing much better. As I rotate it, it pulls the piston in and out. And here you can even see when I turn on the water, it's able to push the piston back, which rotates the crankshaft. But I actually don't want a water cannon pushing this, I want a steam cannon. I was hoping to turn this water cannon into a steam cannon by putting a torch in front of it, but it had been a really long time since I had made a steam cannon in this game, and I forgot you don't actually need to put the torch in front of the water, because then the water gets sprayed on it and makes it go out. But instead you want to heat up the water cannon with a torch or just something similar to that. So I just built up a setup like this where I have a torch underneath the water cannon, and you can see it's generating steam. Now you may wonder why I want steam instead of just water, and the reason is steam is like, I think I read this on the wiki, like 8 times more powerful than water. So it's a much better choice for powering an engine than water. So after I got that working, I decided to delete a bunch of it. What I'm doing is replacing a lot of my previous piston cylinder area with smooth surface blocks. And the reason I'm replacing it with that is that the smooth surface blocks have lower friction, so it should allow it to slide much more freely than it was before. So after I got those in place, I just had to recreate the piston and reconnect it to the crankshaft. And once I did that, I gave it another test here, and you can see just by me dragging it around, it's moving much more smoothly. So I decided to copy that and then mirror it over and just try to make a very simple engine here with just 2 cylinders. Now the reason I wanted to try this was to try just some of my timing mechanics out to see when I needed to fire each of the 2 pistons. So I just had to move the second piston so that'd be further up in its cycle, and then just had to set the second steam cannon to be set by a different keybind as well. And once I did that, I tried to give it a run, but it just wouldn't really move. In fact, it seemed like it was kind of jammed up and just wouldn't do anything at all. And I was kind of wondering why this was the case, because when I just hooked up the bracing to one of the pistons, it seemed to rotate fine, and it was either one of the pistons. So the jamming must have somehow been coming from the crankshaft, and I had realized the problem was I actually needed 2 swivel joints, 1 for each of the pistons. Because once I did that and gave it another test, you can see it's moving around like no problem at all. So once I finally got those 2 pistons hooked up, I decided to get my angle meter out and use that to time when to turn on each of the pistons. So what I did is told it when to fire the left steam cannon. And you can see here on the bottom half of the rotation, the left steam cannon ends up turning on. And what I want is actually the opposite of that for the other steam cannon. I want it to turn on the upper half of the rotation. So to do that, all I have to do is put in a logic gate and then tell it to invert the signal coming from the angle meter so it always turns on at the opposite time of the left steam cannon. But when I went to give it a quick test here, somehow both steam cannons were turning on, and I realized the problem was I had them on toggle mode instead of hold to shoot mode. And once I fixed that, you can see the engine's totally rotating on its own. I'm not hitting anything here, so the steam cannon should work as a source of power, and the angle meter should work as the timing mechanism. So now that I had a proof of concept sort of working, I decided to copy over one of these cylinder and pistons and get to work on the actual triangle design. So the first thing I did was just delete all of the unnecessary wood I had, because I was just going to use pins for testing since it just makes it so much easier to see what's going on. And then to start working on that Deltic design, I decided to copy over my cylinder, flip it over, and then have them opposing each other. So here we have in the center, basically one explosion pushing both the pistons straight out. Now I'd also noticed that this one torch was sort of glitching out, and that what I had accidentally done was just put 2 wood pieces inside of the torches. So I deleted those, and after I did that, everything seemed to be working fine. So I started working on the second leg of the engine. Now here I have to be super careful with how I position these. I want them to line up perfectly so that when I put in the crankshaft, they'll end up giving power at just the right time. So after getting the positioning set just right, you can see they're lining up right on top of each other. And after I get those, I can actually just delete those wood blocks since I only needed them for positioning. And then finally, I copied over the third leg. I just had to rotate it in place. And then once again, use my little measuring trick to make sure it lines up perfectly. So I had to do this on both sides, but ideally what would happen is that once I lined up one of these sides, the other one would just end up lining up fine. So I got everything lining up on the one side, and I checked on the other side, and it was also lined up perfectly. So that was a good sign that I got the positioning set up right. And the next thing to do is set up all 3 of the crankshafts, because this engine is a little weird and it has literally like 3 crankshafts. So after I got all those in place, I started putting in the cranks and working on attaching all the pistons to the crankshaft. So for that, I had to do it in a very similar way to what I did before. So I added in a couple of swivel joints and then connected them to the pistons. And here I got one piston hooked up and it works fine, but the brace ends up falling a block, and this is really just unnecessary. So I took all of those crankshafts and lowered them a block, and then hooked them up to their pistons, and it looked a little more normal. And after just making sure to brace everything here, I gave it another quick test, and it seemed to work except one of the pistons ended up falling out of its cylinder. And I had looked as to why, and I had realized that I had started it in its most extreme position, but it still actually had some distance to pull back. So what I had to do is delete those 2 sets of pistons, and instead just move them to just the right position so that once the crankshaft ends up pulling them all the way back, they're going to be at the most extreme position and they won't fall out of the crankshaft. So after I got that, you can see I can rotate it and it seems to be fine. So I just had to copy the one piston that I had edited over to the other side and then connect it to the other crankshaft. And once I did that, you can see I can rotate it and it works in a very similar way. So finally I had to get this top crankshaft working, and this one's actually the weirdest one because it points straight down, while the other 2 point straight out. I technically could have done this with any combination of angles for these crankshafts, but it ends up being most convenient when that top set of opposing pistons are fully expanded, because it means both their 2 notches end up pointing straight out, while the one in the bottom points straight down. So after I got that, I just built it up in a very similar way to what I did for the other 2, and then finally I just had to position 2 pistons in just the right spot, and then hook them up to the crankshaft. And once I got the one hooked up, I just mirrored it to the other side, and then had to hook it up to the crankshaft as well, and you can see here as I rotate it, just like the other 2. So now that I had all 3 of these working, the next step was to somehow connect them together. Now before I did that though, I wanted to set all 3 sets of water cannons to have different keybinds, so I'd be able to fire them at different times just for testing purposes, and also later once I add in the angle meters to control them. And you can see here I'm able to control them separately. And now I want to start adding in the 4-bar linkages to connect all of these crankshafts together. Now I could use gears to do this as well, but gears in this game are always a little interesting, so ideally I'd be able to use as few as possible, and 4-bar linkages end up just working very well. So I just have to connect up 4 swivel joints to all of the crankshafts, and then use braces to connect them together like this. Now what this is going to allow me to do is, you can see here in this test, as I rotate the bottom crankshaft, the rotation is carried to the top crankshaft, and now they're technically rotating together. So I also need to connect in that bottom left crankshaft, and for that I just used 4 more bracing pieces and 8 more swivel joints. And then finally I just hooked up the first crankshaft to the last crankshaft. I technically didn't need to do this, but it just makes it a bit more stable. And once I got that done, you can see here as I rotate the one crankshaft, they all rotate. Now this was close to working, but if you look at the graphic again, these 2 crankshafts actually rotate the same direction, but this one actually rotates in the opposite direction. So I'm going to need some way to invert its rotation, and for that, I will need to stick in 1 pair of gears to get that to work. So what I did is just hooked up 2 of the crankshafts together. These are the 2 that stay in unison. And finally, that third crankshaft, I added in a gear, and then the second gear as well. And you can see here, when I pin it in place, I'm able to rotate them around. And then finally, when I just tell the one gear to get stuck to the crankshaft, as I rotate one of the gears, he rotates the entire crankshaft. And I'll use some swivel joints to connect it up to the other 2 crankshafts. And now finally, as I rotate any of the crankshafts, they should rotate the other 2. And it seems to be happening. And with that out of the way, the next thing to work on was the timing. Now for this I wanted to use angle meters again since it kind of worked out last time, and what I needed to do was precisely time when to turn on each of these steam cannons. So the idea is when they got as close as possible to steam cannon, I would fire them, and then they'd keep firing until they got to their furthest extent where they'd stop. So I set that up for the first piston here. You can see as I rotate the crankshaft, the steam cannon ends up turning on at the right time. And I gotta set it up for the second and the third sets of opposing pistons as well. The convenient thing about this is that since I have 3 sets of opposing pistons, the timings for each pair are identical. So I hooked up the second one as well, and you can see here as I rotate the crankshaft how the first one fires, then the second one fires to push it even more forwards. And finally I just had to add on 1 more angle meter as well, and this one's for that last piston in the back. And after I got that, it seemed like everything was working. Now, it was able to rotate about half of the way on its own, but then it gets stuck. And I kind of expected this, but I was hoping it wouldn't be a big issue. And the reason is, this engine only gives power during half of its cycle. So the 3 pistons fire 1, 2, 3, and then they return 1, 2, 3. So this means that half the cycle I'm generating no power at all. So what I was going to need to do instead was copy over the entire engine and just tweak it a little bit so that when the first part of this engine is doing its returning phase, the second part of the engine is delivering power and vice versa. So I'll always have 1 or 2 pistons giving me power for the entire cycle. So to get started, I set all of the sets of steam cannons to have different keybinds from the first set. And then next, I changed the bottom set of opposing pistons, so instead of them starting at their fullest extent, they're actually starting fully contracted. So after I just pushed those in place, what I had to do is just rebrace them to the crankshaft, and also just rotate the crankshaft 180 degrees to make that work. But because of that slight rotation, that also messed up the other 2 legs of the crankshaft as well, so I had to push them in a little bit further. But this actually created some problems. So here I tried to go for a test, you can see nothing's really happening. It seems like it's just getting stuck. And nothing really changed except for the fact that I moved in this one crank, and I realized the problem was that I was kind of grabbing onto the smooth surface blocks. So to fix that, the first thing I thought to do was just shrink down the size of the wooden block, but that didn't seem to really solve the problem, and instead just pushing out the smooth surface blocks further away from it did seem to fix it. And after I did that, you can see the crankshaft's once again able to freely rotate. So I just put that on the piston that is opposing the one that I just fixed. And then finally, just to simplify things a bit, all I had to do was copy what I just made, rotate it, and then put it in place on the other leg. And once I had that, I just had to make sure to brace the crankshaft again, or both of the crankshafts. And then finally gave it another test, but I had the same problem from before, where it seemed like the smooth surface blocks are grabbing onto the piston. And after fixing that, you can see the crankshaft's able to freely rotate, but for some reason this top set of opposing pistons seems to be firing at the wrong time, and I realized it's because when I copied over the water cannons, it also copied over their keybinds, so I just had to fix that real quick. And after doing that, it seemed to be better, but I had a problem with those 2 water cannons I just fixed. Were supposed to be expanding immediately, but when they did this, they shot out water instead of steam, so it takes a second for the steam to generate, and that water was putting out the torches underneath, so no steam was being generated. So to fix this problem, what I'm going to do is put in the timer block, tell it to wait I think about half a second after the level begins, and what this does is delays it just long enough so that the water cannons can never shoot out water, and they'll have to get heated up enough to shoot out steam first. And after I fix that here, you can see now they're shooting out steam instead of water, and the engine's back to working like we expect. So I just had to mess with the angles a little bit to make sure everything was working perfectly, and then finally I put them on top of each other, and realized that their crankshafts are actually rotating in opposite directions. So this actually is not a big problem at all. All I have to do is invert the direction of all of the angle meters on the top part of the engine. After doing that, it actually rotates fine. In fact, here, I'm not even touching it at all. It's able to just rotate on its own. Now, during half its cycle, it's not getting any power. The only reason it's able to do this is just the inertia it has. But it's actually neat to see it fully working kind of on its own here. So what I did is brace the top 3 crankshafts to the bottom 3 crankshafts and effectively locked the entire engine together. I deleted the stuff I had on the side since I wasn't really using it anymore. And then also what I did is took all of the pins in this thing and just removed them. Now my reasoning for this is I want to put this on a car, and to do that I can't really have any pins. It needs to be able to freely move around. So basically I'm just building up this massive wooden frame to just connect everything together. So it took me a little while to do this. Fortunately, making the top was easier than the bottom since I could copy a lot of what I already made. But finally I ended up with this setup. Now it is working, but you can see the top's sort of moving back and forth a lot. So I used a few bracing pieces to hopefully hold it together a bit more, and this really seemed to help, but it was still moving a lot more than I'd like, and especially while the car was going on its own, stopping, whatever it was doing, turning. Thought it might cause a lot of problems. So I put in some cross braces as well, and once I did this, it was almost perfectly rigid. So once I had that, I decided to start putting in some wheels, and I just went for some small wheels because I thought it was kind of funny with the big engine. And now to give it a test, you can see it's actually able to support itself, and I don't have unbraking on right now, so it actually is supporting itself. And I replaced the back wheel with a gear and then put the wheel on top of that gear. And after I did that, I locked them together with a bracing piece, put a gear on top of the one gear that's attached to the wheel. And then to get power to that gear, what I did is put a gear on top of the crankshaft that'll rotate with the crankshaft. I put another gear that's meshing with the gear on top of the crankshaft, and that gear is directly on top of the gear that's attached to the wheel. This is getting extremely confusing. And if I lock them together with a bracing piece, you can see here they begin to mesh and they should start rotating the wheel. Now it's a little weak right now. I had to use a few bracing pieces to hold those gears in place. And then I used a couple swivel joints and then used a bracing piece to hold them together to hold those gears meshed. And after I did that, it looked like the engine was going to stop, but fortunately it did start moving. And I was actually able to get some usefulness out of the steam power. Now, of course, the car isn't very good if it can't turn, so I added in some steering blocks as well to be able to move it from side to side. and this is where a big problem emerged. So here as they begin turning, the engine gets weaker and weaker until around now, it just flat out stops working. And I didn't really understand why. I thought maybe it was some sort of time thing, but I let it go straight for a really long time and it ended up working out fine. And it had occurred to me then, the angle meters were actually kind of a big issue. They weren't measuring the angle relative to the rest of the body of the engine. They were measuring the angle relative to the ground. So as I turned, their angles progressively got worse and worse until eventually they just got so bad that they were unusable. So instead of using angle meters, which you can't really turn the engine with, instead what I'm going to do is use sensors. Now the sensors are going to look for when the piston is below them and either tell the water cannon to shoot or to stop shooting. So you can see I have one of those here in place, and just have to adjust its settings a little bit so that it's properly detecting when the piston is below it. And once I did that, you can see its light flashes when it sees the piston below it. And then I just need to put in one more sensor, and this was going to tell the piston to stop expanding since it's at its furthest extent. And once I did that, you can see that the lights flash almost back and forth as the piston moves back and forth. So I set the sensors to output the same signal, and I ran that signal into a logic gate, and the logic gate will toggle whenever it sees that signal. Now in this test, things weren't so successful, and I was kind of wondering why, but then I realized I accidentally left in the old angle meter system, so it was sort of fighting it. And after I deleted that, you can actually see here, it was working as intended. So now that I had one set of opposing pistons working perfectly off the sensor system, all I had really left to do at this point was make all of them off that system. So I changed all of them out, and finally, I got it moving again. Now the way I configured things this time, it's actually rotating in the opposite direction, but it should work just the same. So guys, thanks for watching. Glad I got this engine working. It's definitely a weird one, and it's actually cool too. I didn't need to use any of my no-bound stuff, so everything here, except I guess for the elongated smooth surface blocks, is technically stock. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, and otherwise, until next time.